I'm the only law clerk Reed ever had while he was active for his 19 years. He never had another law clerk from Kentucky, which I thought was very odd, and I really thought he should have done more for Kentucky than he did as far as law clerks. But I went to a lot of oral arguments, more than, I'd say more than, but I don't know that any of the clerks went to more than I did, because I thoroughly enjoyed it. I enjoyed being in the courtroom and listening to that, and every time I walked in, I was inspired. It was like going into a cathedral, and it never left me. All the Justice Warren said, recognized Solicitor General, and he stood up and he said, Your Honor, I have the pleasure of presenting Gordon B. Davidson of Kentucky, blah, blah, blah. Looked at his credentials and so on. Well, the funny part of this story is that Frankfurter always turned his chair around with his back to where the podium. He wanted to show his distaste, plus the fact he was always reading something. So when Sobolov said my name, Frankfurter spun around and looked down at me and went, "Hello." That's the only time I ever saw him jolly. But I remember the horror and shock and sadness on the day he died. The whole court was devoted to him. I would say he was as well liked and as admired as any of the justices. Really a favorite of most people. Sherman Minton, of course, was a great friend. Tom Clark was a great friend, close friend. And I would say his favorite, Reed's favorite, was Burton. I never will forget, Reed told me on more than one occasion, he said, "I don't know that I'll ever get to meet Jesus Christ, but having met Harold Burton is about as near as I'll ever get." He and Frankfurter had their ups and downs, as Frankfurter did with everybody. Right. That was part of his methodology, I think. But he was, Frankfurter, it was always, Frankfurter came to our office more than any other justice. Well, Kozol was a Harvard graduate, and so I guess he felt I wasn't up to his standards, but it suited me fine. But he and Kozol would really get into it. I mean, Kozol would just say, "I don't agree with you, Mr. Justice." It's blah, blah, blah. "No, what do you mean?" And at one point, one time, Frankfurter picked up a book, a law book, case book, and threw it at Kozol. Literally threw it across the room at him.
Was there much discussion in the chambers about what had just had occurred?
No, not in our chambers. Reed had had a very difficult time, I think, the year before with Fassett and his other clerk, George Mickham. And particularly, since I understood it, this didn't come out in so much in Fassett's book as it did orally. And maybe he doesn't want it to come out, I don't know. Mickham is now deceased. But he was a very conservative young man and a very staunch Catholic. And I use those terms advisedly together, meaning a conservative Catholic. And he was very much opposed to the Brown decision and kept feeding the justice all the facts of why the justice ought to be opposed to it. Fassett, on the other hand, was much more liberal and much more in favor of the opinion. And particularly, it got down to not so much how the justice would, his vote wouldn't mean anything. It became clear, even in those days, that the majority was going to vote in favor of the Brown decision, or outlawing segregation. But it was a question of whether he was going to dissent or not. And Mickham thought he should, and Fassett thought he shouldn't. So that was but that was the year before. So by that time, the Rubicon had been crossed as far as Reed was concerned. And the justice was as worried about the Brown II, the mandate, the decree, He was opposed to how it was done and when it was done. And of course that was the exact issue focused on in Brown 2, is when.
During Brown 1, it was clear that the clerks were pretty well muzzled and kept out of the deliberations. A few exceptions, but only a few. Was that the case in Brown 2?
Not as much. No, the secrecy was not nearly as bad. And no, the wording was never, to my way, discussed. You know, the justice saw it. I don't know that we even saw it before it was delivered. The final draft. I mean, we kind of knew what I was going to say, but we didn't. You know the story of that, which is in all these books, where that phrase comes from.
Tell it for the taper.
Well, we always thought that either Pollock or Gunther invented it, but scratch them, they don't get any credit at all. Felix Frankfurter suggested it because Oliver Wendell Holmes had used it in many cases involving equity. He used it as an equitable maxim. Holmes did. Now, Frankfurter or somebody did a lot of research. Well, I think this guy wrote Simple Justice did. They did a lot of research. They couldn't find it anywhere in the Old English or anything. But what they did find was a poem called Hounds of Heaven, written by a Catholic scholar, in which he had used the term deliberate speed. It wasn't with all deliberate speed, but with deliberate speed. And so the writer seems to think that Holmes stumbled onto this phrase from the poem. And then he used it. Holmes doesn't say this, but this is the assumption. And then Frankfurter got it from Holmes, and then Frankfurter urged the chief to use it. So that's the origin of it, which is right interesting. As several of the Virginia lawyers did, of the fact they shouldn't have the integration or the desegregation because not only were the blacks not up to speed intellectually, they had more disease, they had more crime, they shouldn't be mixed in, particularly with the disease, and he made an issue of venereal disease. And then Thurgood Marshall gets his turn at bat, and he stood up in his swallowtail coat. Of course, he was a handsome man, and he just stood for a few minutes, not long. It seemed long, but it wasn't long. And he said, you know, he said, it's amazing to me that the black people of the state of Virginia would make the argument they made when the black people of Virginia, with those syphilitic hands, those venereal diseases, raised 5 presidents of the United States. Well, I mean, it was the most dramatic thing. The important thing about Brown, in my opinion, the single most important thing is it pulled the cork out of the bottle. It started us on finally doing something that we should have been doing all along. By we, I mean the American people and the government. It started us down the road of recognizing the problem and trying to help solve it. And that it did. We wouldn't have had the Martin Luther Kings and the Rosa Parkses and the people that it gave them the starch, the moxie, if you will, to stand up and say, okay, now the Supreme Court said this, and now we want some. So it was a great service, and no question it was one of the great decisions the court has ever made, and the correct decision.